Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 1st of May, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today is Charles Malet. Welcome to the programme, Charles.
Thank you, Mike.
And from Damascus, Vanessa Beeley. And Vanessa, we're going to get started today with assisted dying because on Monday in the House of Commons, some MPs decided to get together and have a discussion about how they can dispatch us even quicker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very sorry that I'm bringing Matt Hancock back to your screens. As Mike said, on Monday, MPs debate assisted dying after a petition calling for changes to the UK law hits 200,000. So let's have a look at what Matt Hancock put out on X, formerly Twitter. For 50 years, we've had a legal choice over who to love. For a decade, we've had a legal choice over who we can marry. The time has come for Parliament to vote on changing the law to allow assisted dying to help prevent terminally ill people from suffering very painful deaths. And again, I apologize, but we're just going to roll a video of part of Matt Hancock's speech. We'll have a discussion about his expression after the video. Thanks, Mike.
And I was also deeply affected and persuaded by my constituent, David Minns. And today I had the honour of meeting his son, Matt Minns. And David, who has now died, he was in the awful situation of having a disease that he himself had watched his own daughter die an incredibly painful death. And to those who say palliative care needs to be better and palliative care can be enough, of course it needs to be better. And of course people give their careers to amazing palliative care. But the best palliative care in the world cannot prevent hugely painful deaths for some. So yes, the safeguards are vital. Internationally, we now can see many states, many countries, like Australia, that have brought in a narrow and a clear set of rules. But the people I want to have the choice are those facing a painful death when they know that death is coming, with the protections, of course, for people with disabilities, for those with mental ill health, but making sure that all of us should have the choice when we know for certain we're facing such pain at the end that we can instead have a dignified and good death. And I know I'd want that choice for myself.
I'm sure there might be a cue to respond to his request for that choice for himself. But let's have a look at what people on Twitter came out and basically mobbed his tweet. On X, I apologise. Russler, you were responsible for a live trial of this back in spring 2020 when the UK had 50,000 excess deaths during lockdown caused not by COVID, but by the COVID response and treatment protocols, DNR, NG163, and of course, midazolam. And then another one, which was pretty representative of what was being said to him. Obviously, if Matt Hancock assisted 50,000 people to die with his COVID response, then he's going to want it legalized before he'd be charged of depraved indifference, manslaughter, and murder. That's an interesting point to be made. Then let's have a look at those that are pushing back against the idea of assisted dying, which of course we've covered extensively in Canada. Care Not Killing, an organization that is definitely countering the idea of legitimizing medically assisted death, is a UK-based organisation. And what they're basically arguing, of course, is that it will put pressure on those that are either terminally ill or depressed, some that are homeless, to effectively force them into making a decision to accept medically assisted end to their life. Now, back in 2021, Matt Hancock calls for more data on end-of-life care and assisted dying. He apparently addressed an organisation, an APPG group called Dying Well, that is effectively against assisted dying. If we can just move on there and then move on again, because what he basically said in this article He's endorsed the idea of setting up a What Works Centre to gather evidence on the quality of palliative care in the UK and inform debate around assisted dying. As I said, he was speaking to the all-party parliamentary group on dying well. But let's have a look at these What Works centres. This is what he was recommending to gather the evidence on the effectiveness of palliative care and the argument for assisted dying. So the claim is the centre will bring together the evidence about the relative impacts on well-being of policies and projects, their cost, and the quality of the evidence. The evidence programmes have been commissioned by the Economic and Social Research Council on behalf of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. The centre also has a role to support the development of the evidence base. They claim that they are independent of government with a clear and relevant policy and delivery process. But let's have a look. This is from the Cabinet Office in November 2023. The What Works Network Strategy sets out how the Evaluation Task Force Secretariat of the network expects to deliver its vision over the next 5 years. And then let's have a look at who's funding them. The centres are funded by a combination of government and non-government sources, including the Economic and Social Research Council, the Dormant Asset Scheme, and the National Lottery Community Fund. The Evaluation Task Force, as the Secretariat, promotes and supports the independent What Works network. From the actual strategy document, stronger advocacy for the importance of long-term funding and independence of WWCs. Funding arrangements of the current 13 WWCs are diverse. For the 10 WWCs that have been established as independent organizations, but over 85% of their funding comes from government departments, research agencies, or other public bodies. And it mentions notable exceptions. So I think we again see a government-funded, evidence-producing network that will potentially corroborate government policy. And then I sort of stumbled on this because I was actually looking to see what China and Russia's policy is on assisted dying in Russia, and in China it's currently illegal. And this is Wan Yizhu, who is a Chinese academic who wrote for Unheard on Matt Hancock's proposal for assisted dying. One only has to consider the experience of the now memory-hold Liverpool care pathway under which patients were starved to death in the name of end-of-life care to realise the immense potential for abuse of legalised euthanasia within the NHS. Healthcare is ruinously expensive. Euthanasia is cheap and value for money. No healthcare administrator, however well-intentioned, can ignore utilitarian considerations entirely. But the legalization of euthanasia will make the moral hazard irresistible. The incontrovertible truth is that at a time of aging populations and strained government budgets, it is absolutely impossible to establish a euthanasia regime that will not be abused, as has happened in every country in which it has been legalized. And I think those are pretty strong points that are being made by pretty much everyone that is against the idea of medically assisted dying. It was also interesting to see that Matt Hancock on April the 26th was pushing the mRNA vaccine technology for cancer. Fantastic to see personalized cancer treatment available on the NHS using the mRNA vaccine technology that saved so many lives during COVID. I hope one day we will look back and say this moment was a turning point in the battle against cancer. And I just want to go back to 2022, the Right to Life News, Matt Hancock to make a documentary on assisted suicide. And in the headline photograph, they included a few comments again from people on Twitter. Genuinely frightening. I think you've assisted enough. Is this a parody account? I can't read the rest of them because it's a little bit small for me here. He's still obsessed with killing people off. The care home scandal clearly wasn't enough of a fix for him. And I think it's worth going back to the COVID era. And in 2020, the BBC reported that Matt Hancock was allowing those that were seeking assisted dying in Switzerland to travel even during lockdown. So perhaps that saved some of the cost of midazolam or care home deaths.
Yes, indeed. Vanessa, in his little video clip, what was he said? There would, of course, be protections for disabled and for people with ill health. What was he saying there? He was mainly focusing on people that were going to otherwise suffer an extremely painful passing. And that was what he wanted. That was the issue that he wanted to solve. But don't worry, we've got protections in place for these people. Does that mean that they don't get to have a painless passing? I'm not quite sure exactly what his argument was there, but nonetheless,
I think Go on. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, nonetheless, his whole demeanour when he was delivering those lines reeked of insincerity, shall we say?
He was utterly shifty throughout the entire presentation, as far as I can work out. And of course, that's coming hot on the heels of a serious pushback in Canada against assisted dying, where homeless people were effectively being pushed down that route. Depressed people were being pushed down that route. And it was being their desire not to be a burden on relatives, for example, was being exploited, and people were being fast-tracked down the assisted dying route. So that, I think, is a very cynical attempt by Hancock to effectively say, well, we won't be doing that. We won't be, suggesting to the homeless, the depressed, and the terminally ill who might benefit from palliative care, but might be persuaded that they're too much of a burden for their relatives, their family, and too much of a cost on the state. I think that's also an extremely important point that was made by the Chinese academic, is that cost effectiveness of this policy will definitely come into play.
Indeed. And, recently we have hosted a symposium on the issue of deaths in the NHS. And then, of course, we premiered Jackie Devoy's documentary, Playing God, a couple of weeks ago. On the same issue. So that's the sort of type of assisted dying that is going on, Charles, whenever there's no law in place to allow it. What would the situation be when the brakes come off?
Well, I think this is it. I mean, it's totally absurd to suggest that it could be an objective procedure. I mean, exactly what, like Vanessa's been saying, that there's absolutely no question that other factors would be introduced into the decision-making process. And the other thing that jumped out at me was his reference to mental ill health and, in effect, the conflation of two separate issues, but both under the banner of pain. And when would it come that somebody who's deemed to be in mental pain would then be put forward as a candidate for this? So it's very disturbing.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's move on then to a reminder about the King's speech from last November. And in the course of the programme today, we're going to talk about two pieces of legislation that were on this. First is the Investigatory Powers (Brackets) Amendment Bill, which is now the Investigatory Powers (Brackets) Amendment Act, and we'll talk about that a little later in the programme. But first of all, the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, because this was tweeted out by Silky Carlo a couple of days ago. New David Davis MP has today warned that the government's new bank snoopers charter would erode financial privacy like never before in our country and must be dropped. How much longer will you attempt to defend the indefensible? Mel Stride, said Silky Carlo, and this linked to an Express article. Now, in the article, this is what David Davis was saying. Under the proposals, everyone in receipt of money from the government's Department for Work and Pensions will be of special interest, including the 10 million Brits who receive the state pension. The idea that pensioners should be caught up in the net of this giant financial fishing exercise is completely absurd. So the legislation is going to allow the government access to people's bank accounts and so on. But of course, this is the least of the issues here. Now, if we go back again to I can't remember exactly when this frequently asked questions document was released, but we covered it at the time. And there were a number of claims that the government was attempting to address in their digital ID FAQ, and it's related to the legislation that we're talking about here. And the first claim that we talk about is here that the government is creating a mandatory ID card. And they claim that the fact is that the proposed legislation does not include any proposal to create either a digital or physical ID card. The government is committed to making it as easy as possible for people to prove who they are online and access the services that they need without creating mandatory ID cards. And of course, this is at the very least misleading. I would say it's possibly more than misleading because whether they mandate the use of ID cards in law, the mandatory nature of them is coming through the fact that you're required to have them for accessing government services online, because everything is being made digital, and many other services. So that is at the very least a misleading statement. Here's another one. This will make it easier for hackers to get hold of my data, is the claim. And they say that the fact is that cybersecurity is a critical priority for the government. We recognize how important it is to protect users and their data, and have robust measures in place to ensure the security and integrity of online government services and systems. And again, at the very least, this is completely misleading, because there have been some fairly major incidents of data breaches with, in this case, millions of children. The data breach for millions of children ruled unlawful, but actually it was a huge amount of data going missing for children in the UK. Another claim that they wanted to debunk in their digital ID FAQ, that sharing data in this way will erode my privacy rights. And their claim is that the government has stringent data protection processes in place. All data sharing is compliant with data protection legislation and guidance published by the Information Commissioner's Office. This will remain the case for any and all data sharing subsequent to the proposed legislation. This, again, is at the very least misleading, if not a complete lie, because when we look at the legislation itself, which is the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and we look at the long title, it says, a bill to make provision for the regulation of the provision of information relating to identified or identifiable living individuals, to make provision about services consisting of the use of information to ascertain and verify facts about individuals, to make provision about access to customer data and business data, to make provision about privacy and electronic communications, to make provision about services for the provision of electronic signatures, electronic seals, and other trust services, to make provision about the disclosure of information to improve public service delivery, to make provision for the implementation of agreements on sharing information for law enforcement purposes, to make provision about the keeping and maintenance of registers of births and deaths, to make provision about the information standards for health and social care, to establish the Information Commission, to make provision about oversight for biometric data and for connected purposes. This will allow the broad brush sharing of data like we've never seen it before. This effectively removes data protection in this country in many, many areas, and not least our medical data. So when they say that it's making provision for medical use of data, we've got to realize that what they intend to do is to export that data. And just one example here, this is a scientific paper from 2018, in fact, and this was discussing the transfer of genomic data to third countries, which has now been enabled by Brexit, because, of course, once the UK was out of the EU's data protection regime, the UK could basically do what it wants. And so, in fact, this legislation enables exactly this, the sharing of medical data with companies outside the UK, and particularly in the United States, with impunity and no particular restrictions. Now, we're going to come on to the information, the Snoopers Charter later on in the programme, which takes us even further. But this is quite an incredible piece of legislation which needs to be opposed. And I don't think there's the public awareness of what it actually does yet to build that opposition. Charles, in the meantime, digital ID in Africa, what's going on there?
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. Yes, good afternoon all. Changing continents, but effectively the theme is the same. And as we must ask ourselves with every initiative like this that concerns Africa, is it really an African initiative, and is it really for the benefit of Africans? So we start with the announcement from Kenya, the Cabinet Secretary Awalo, advocating for an integrated African digital identity. And this was a recent announcement last week. He is the Information Communications and Digital Economy Cabinet Secretary, and he talks about a uniform digital identity that Africa as a continent moves together in growing its digital economy and fulfilling the aspirations of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And this was during the launch of the Transform Africa Summit. So we'll just remind ourselves of the free trade area, which effectively is a single market. And again, is this really for the benefit of Africans, and is it an idea from within or not? Here are some jolly folk from the government of Kenya talking about the announcement of the Transform Africa Summit, which will take place later this year. So we don't have any further information about that. But what we can point towards, again, from outside Africa, you'll note in the top left-hand corner the familiar colours of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. In this case, number 16.9. And we now have the annual Identity Day. So where has this come from and why is it there? And we look at the ID for Africa, the organisation that was started in April 2018 in Abuja. It was enthusiastically received by the global identity and development community, and it's said that 99% of delegates in attendance who saw the initiative as a rallying cry to keep in mind the importance of SDG 16.9 and to keep countries focused on its achievement. So substantial pressure from without, and we'll just look at ID for Africa in a bit more detail. The reason for that is that they have a conference or a summit coming up in May 21st to 24th in Cape Town, and their objectives or the outcomes they want to deliver on are listed on this sort of checkerboard here. So we'll just pick out a couple of them just to get the drift of what they're doing with it. They want to highlight the various approaches for digital transformation, including the emerging digital public infrastructure anchored on digital identity. And that's the crux of all of this, is the anchoring on digital identity. This is why it's being pushed so hard. But they talk about it being, or this conference being to do with game changers for digital transformation and the adoption of digital identity across the continent. Now, with all of these things, going back to the influence and whether it is from within or without, we should look at how these things are funded. And of course, what we see is that amongst the development partners are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And it's worth noting that a lot of the others concern the development of children and indeed sort of capturing people while they're young. But specifically on the Gates Foundation, here's the committed grants section of the foundation showing that ID for Africa, admittedly not an enormous sum of money, but they received $250,000, which in fact is an annual thing to advance responsible use of digital identity and digital public infrastructure. So little doubt as to whether Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is in fact pulling the strings. Children's Health Defence on X or Twitter are fairly outspoken about what they think this is. And you'll remember that a couple of months ago, I referred to the Maisha number, the system sort of identity for life, number for life in Kenya. Bill Gates pushes digital ID for newborns in Kenya. Maisha number is a biometric system that will replace birth certificates and track children from birth to 5 years of age to ensure children receive vaccines. And that's a quote from Dr. Wahome Ngari. So Children's Health Defence very much on the front foot with that, but why would they be? And we see from Business Daily, this is going back to last autumn 23, the Gates Foundation to advise on the Maisha number rollout. So quite clearly, perhaps not to be described as a conflict of interest, but they're both controlling it from all sides. And the chief executive there of the foundation talking about their role, which they describe as being always as an advisor. We can connect the government to key technical experts and partners, but we're very encouraged by what we see. A strong, robust, open-source digital identity system which leverages financial inclusion, advances in healthcare, in education and other services. We've been working with some other partners that we have, said Mr. Sussman. So the point is, and this relates very much back to Mike's segment, is that it's not necessarily a question of enforcing the digital identity, but it's making it perfectly clear that financial exclusion and being shut out of provision to healthcare are the consequences of not taking it up. back to the ID for Africa summit, and we see the patrons here in the bottom left. Thales, which, if it is a familiar name to you at all, will be one that you associate with defence. And here we see from their website, Defence and Security in the UK. But in actual fact, they're very much involved with digital identity and security, and in fact, trusted digital identity by Thales. So we'll just have a look at a video clip of theirs from 3 years ago as to the direction of travel on this.
Hello everyone, meet Lucy, student in psychology, and me, her digital ID wallet issued by the government to offer a wide range of identity services. In fact, I'm a handy way of proving and protecting her identity both online and face-to-face. Let's have a closer look at what I can do. I can help governments to better communicate with citizens. Right now, I'm reminding Lucy of the appointment she needs to schedule for her mandatory vaccination.
There we go. I cut it short there because you get the idea, but that is part of a longer clip in which essentially this technology controls absolutely every aspect of her life. And so why is this relevant to us? Because recently Thales acquired a firm called Gemalto, who in fact have the contract here for producing passports in the UK. And we see from the government website that they're described as being an experienced and trusted company, and they work with over 40 countries around the world. And with the UK government, they're involved in a number of areas, including the production of driving licenses, UK biometric residence permit cards, and on e-gates at the border. So this is all very, very much connected, and we link it back to Africa. And of course, we see that, in fact, this is not so much an African initiative. It is a one world initiative, and it's being pushed very, very hard at the moment. And we see especially in the UK.
Of course, we now have to have digital ID or some form of photographic ID to vote, which some people will be doing tomorrow.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, okay, let's move on then. If you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, then all the options for helping us out are at support.ukcolumn.org. We do need your help because we're completely funded by our viewers and listeners. So thank you to everybody that has helped, and please do join us if you possibly can. Share everything you find on the various platforms. If you could, that helps a lot as well. Note the new Twitter handle for the UK Column Extracts. That's twitter.com, it's x.com/UKC Extracts. But you could find, have a look at what's on the shop and see if you'd like to pick something up there as well. Now, tomorrow, you interviewed Jason Christoph, that's going out at 1 p.m. tomorrow, premiering.
Absolutely, and I really would recommend that you do watch and listen to this. Jason Christoph is a phenomenal brain in the field of susceptibility to mind control via repetitive messaging, particular sort of mainstream media messaging, and indeed how to avoid falling into those traps, into what he would call self-sabotage. So it's a subject that he has a very, very deep knowledge of, not just how to control the mind, but for ill, but also for good. So I would really encourage you to get into that. It was fantastic to talk to him.
And Brian's interview with Rosie from the White Rose went out at 1 p.m. yesterday. If you didn't see that, that's on the UK Column website now. It's the next in the Gutsy Women series. And on Sunday, we will be hosting a symposium on the World Health Organization with David Bell, Sylvia Berendt, and others, calling for the safeguarding the rule of law, equity, and an appropriate review process in the World Health Organization lawmaking processes. This is mainly looking at the legal aspects of this, but that will begin at 6 p.m. on Sunday the 5th in the usual places, ukcolumn.org/live, and also on the community website for UK Column members. Now, we mentioned that there's an election tomorrow, but we are keen to support anybody that's standing as an independent.
I think that's exactly the way it should be put, really, because it puts a marker in the sand, and it is a register of the public mood concerning democracy as a whole, but specifically the very sort of sensitive area of police and crime commissioners. And you may recall that on the 3rd of April, we had Matthew Randolph on Extra, who is campaigning for Police and Crime Commissioner in Gloucestershire. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the shameful way in which he was treated as an independent candidate by the BBC, who had a duty to interview all the candidates. And we'll just listen to something from Rachel Matthews's Colchester Council Watch, in which she spoke to Matthew about what happened during his interview. And it's worth noting that he's campaigning on a ticket of truth and transparency, and in particular, the illegal rollout of 5G in Gloucestershire and the vaccine injuries and the failure to act on this by police. Just before you listen to the clip, I should point out you hear some laughing in the background. That's because it was recorded by somebody else who was absolutely astonished to be hearing what you are about to listen to now.
You were then escorted, and
I was not escorted off the premises at all.
You had a conversation with the police.
I had a conversation with the police, and the police left, and I was then allowed to carry on and ask my question. So please do not twist it and say I was escorted off the premises, as I was not.
The reason I ask this is because, for whatever the reason, with the police being called to that meeting, do you think that's the sort of conduct that people expect from their next Police and Crime Commissioner?
I think what we expect is when a question is raised to the council, we get an honest answer. And we attend these council meetings regularly, and we do not get honest answers from the council. They have installed 5G illegally throughout Gloucestershire. We were trying to raise that with our councillors, and they didn't like to hear that.
Matthew, thank you very much for coming in and joining me on the show today.
Take care.
That's Matthew Randolph, an independent candidate to become Gloucestershire's Police and Crime Commissioner. During the interview, Mr Randolph made a number of allegations which are completely unfounded about the police, Gloucester City Council and the BBC. His claim the police has failed to investigate deaths linked to the vaccine is false and not backed up with scientific evidence. Scientific consensus says the COVID vaccine has in fact saved millions of lives. Driving excess deaths, we would know. Gloucester City Council has in the past refuted claims around 5G masks being unsafe, and wider scientific consensus backs up the case that they aren't harmful. On the BBC misleading people, and that's coming out in the COVID inquiry, that isn't true. Despite all the false claims, we felt it important to give you the opportunity to hear Mr Randolph's views.
It's hard to know what to say to that, Charles, because what... Yeah, I don't know. We'll talk about that in Extra, no doubt.
Tragic and comic at the same time. So we'll just end by reinforcing the message for sort of, look out for your independent candidates. This is how Matthew has presented himself with his campaign literature. And again, you see on the bottom right his appearance on Extra. So if you are minded, please do get out tomorrow to look out your independent candidate.
Thank you. And also on Sunday this weekend, the International Centre for 9/11 Justice is presenting Peace, War and 9/11. This is public screening and Q&A at Chapel Arts Centre in Bath. So that'll be Matt Campbell and Piers Robinson will be answering the questions. So if you're able to get to that on Sunday at 7 p.m, do. And we will have Piers and Matt on the programme on Friday for a brief discussion of this. And then on May the 11th, in the Staining Centre in Fletcher's Croft, Staining in West Sussex, an event is taking place called Western Empire and the Great Reset. Now, that is not the complete list of speakers because I am also speaking at this event, and so is Sandy Adams. So that's a $5 through PayPal or on the door. If you the link for where to send that or how to contact the organisers will be in the show notes. So hopefully we'll see as many people as possible at that event on the 11th. Now, where does that take us to Gaza, Vanessa?
Yeah, to the really deplorable situation in Gaza. We spoke previously about the US establishing this ridiculous humanitarian pier, which is going to be anything but humanitarian. 1,000 US troops will deploy for temporary port operations to move aid into Gaza. It's now been revealed in the last few days that the cost of this project for the United States is $320 million. And this has been reported by Reuters and various others. And of course, we have to ask the question, why not just open the Rafah border from Egypt and allow in the daily 500 trucks that were coming in prior to October the 7th. This is a short excerpt from a Sky News program on the building of the port itself. We can just roll the video.
What would they actually build there? We've got some video of the sort of facility that the US have. This isn't in Gaza. This is to illustrate the sort of capability they have, basically leading onto the shore, but from the deep water. And they hope that this will be able to be completed in a matter of 2 weeks.
So the claim that this will only take 2 weeks to build, of course, there's no coincidence that this is about 20 nautical miles from the Gaza gas exploration area off the coast of Gaza that has not yet been used for the benefit of Gazans since it was discovered. There's also reports that UK troops could be sent to Gaza to help deliver aid. So let's have a look at what they're claiming in The Independent. The government is considering whether to send troops to Gaza to help deliver aid via a new sea route. The US confirmed on Friday that work on a temporary pier. And I need to point out here that the rubble that is being bulldozed to fabricate this temporary pier without doubt contains the remains of Palestinian bodies that have not yet been retrieved from under the rubble. And while the US is spending $320 million on this project, it never considered spending $320 million sending bulldozers to help the civil defense in Gaza to retrieve bodies, both dead and alive. Britain is already providing logistical support for construction of the pier, including a Royal Navy ship that will house hundreds of US soldiers and sailors working on the project. In addition, UK military planners have been embedded at the US Central Command in Florida and Cyprus, where aid will be screened before shipment to Gaza. It's worth also noting that Israel will then have a further verification mechanism when the ships arrive at Gaza, which could potentially, of course, delay even further the so-called humanitarian aid. Now, at the same time, what's happening, so bear in mind they're saying this will take about 2 weeks to establish this humanitarian port. Israel is planning a ring of checkpoints to prevent men from fleeing Rafah. This has actually been confirmed by my sources inside Rafah, that tanks and snipers are establishing a ring around Rafah. The claim is that, according to Middle East Eye in the report, so on the next slide, that they will they will prevent men of military age. So in other words, everybody will be designated as Hamas, as combatants. And they will allegedly allow women and children to leave. Of course, we have absolutely no guarantees or assurances that they will be able to leave safely, as we've already seen women and children being sniped or shot or shelled by tanks as they do try to leave to what I've described as safe areas. And of course, the other point to make is currently Israel is bombing heavily in central Gaza. So it's actually creating a buffer zone between the north and the south. There's around 700,000 people in the north currently suffering predominantly from famine and disease, and then another 1.5 million in central Gaza, but being pushed to the north or to the south. Sorry, there's about 1 million in the south and then the remainder in the middle, which are being pushed north or south. And with the potential, of course, with this Rafah operation, which is being spoken about by various members of Netanyahu's administration, including by Netanyahu himself, the timing is potential, of course, that refugees from Rafah will be deported via the so-called humanitarian port. But also my fear is, of course, that the US and the UK are now intending to establish a military footprint in Gaza itself, perhaps not immediately, but in the future after the devastation, which will be Rafah if the operation goes ahead. And we're looking at a horrendous massacre or potential of a massacre if that does go ahead.
And it's looking much more likely that it is going to go ahead, Vanessa, because the news is that they are starting to train reservists to take part in that. So the training is happening, which it wasn't before. So it's looking much firmer that it's going to go ahead. But coming back to the UK then, Charles, and what's the latest on the Holocaust memorial?
Well, thanks, Mike. It relates closely, of course, to Vanessa's segment in that it's an extremely controversial prospect from the start, but made much more so in the events since the 7th of October last year. But this is the report from, the latest on the Holocaust Memorial. The government now has a department, the foundation there. And effectively, it's been proposed for a site just south of the Houses of Parliament in Victoria Tower Garden. And the reason I've got another icon on the right-hand side of the map on the east side is that that's where the Imperial War Museum hosts the Holocaust galleries. So a while back, I asked the Imperial War Museum what their view was about the very controversial use of land that was supposed to be protected at Victoria Tower Garden. And of course, they highlight that it's less than a mile away and that they want to ensure that the curation and narrative does not replicate the IWM's own galleries. Now, last week, there's an update here reported in the Jewish News. MPs issue warning on Holocaust memorial projects, rising costs and security. And this is because there's now a select committee which have produced a report on the Holocaust Memorial Bill. And in effect, one could look at it one of two ways, because they start by saying they do not wish to amend the bill, but there are certain matters of concern. So are they pulling their punches, or are they setting up the bill to fail? But nonetheless, they say that a full consultation would have lent more legitimacy to the final site decision, and they urge the government to consider how ongoing costs are likely to be paid for and whether it offers appropriate use of public money, and also the steps the government intends to take around the security of any memorial and learning centre. Of course, we've heard a lot recently about the concerns over security, or at least the much hyped concerns over security for Jewish people in the UK. So it's just raft of controversy upon controversy, but that seems to be the latest currently. But just to refresh certainly on the full consultation part, what the government totally failed to do was to pay attention to existing planning restrictions on the site. And so they've ridden roughshod over that. And it's now looking like it's very hard to justify the public money that's being thrown at it, and indeed the increased requirement for public money because of the security implications. So a muddled picture, but we'll carry on reporting as we pick it up.
Okay, now let's come on then to the Investigatory Powers Amendment Bill. The question is, what is this all about? Well, of course, we know that in this country we have some pretty draconian investigatory powers legislation in place that allows all kinds of unpleasant surveillance. It's called the Snooper's Charter, of course, by many people, but it has been amended. And so here's Tom Tugendhat, the Security Minister. He's saying, first, to reassure those who may have been alarmed by some of the recent commentary, Britain is secure, and to remind people of the extraordinary security we have through both our being in NATO and our being a nuclear power. I'm not quite sure what that has to do with snooping, but anyway, he went on to say, these changes mean that not only will our citizens be better protected from serious dangers such as terrorism and child sexual abuse online, their privacy will be better protected too. So my question is he naive? Does he not understand the legislation that he's just amended and given approval to the amendments for? Or is he lying through his teeth? I don't know the answer to that, but let's just look at in detail what they have been talking about. So first of all, the government has decided to reduce what have already been extremely weak protections against security services using our data illegally. And just to remind everybody, security services have been using our data illegally for quite some time. And the whole point of the Investigatory Powers Act in the first place was to effectively retrospectively legalise what they were doing and continue to do. So they're breaking the rules left, right and centre, and this reduces the protections even further. Government has removed a reasonable expectation of privacy. So there is no expectation of privacy as far as the government is concerned on behalf of any member of the general public. The government has not explained why reduction of privacy is necessary rather than just being convenient for them. It potentially permits bulk data collection of facial images and social media data. That, of course, is an intention, because we know that live facial recognition is being tested and is intended to be rolled out by the police, but also social media data as well. And if you remember, I can't remember whether it was Friday's program or Wednesday's last week, we were talking about the use of facial images to ascertain or to identify people's political leanings, and automating that process. We go on here, absolutely permits bulk data collection of internet connection data. Well, that's the case with the Investigatory Powers Act in general, but this takes it a step further and expands the range of politicians who can authorize the surveillance of other politicians. This is quite amazing to me that no politicians seem to be particularly concerned about this, but requires tech companies to inform government of any plans to strengthen security or privacy features in their software. This is a direct attack on end-to-end encryption, and this is one of the main features of these amendments, is to try to roll back on end-to-end encryption that's already out there. It permits government vetoing such security or privacy features. So tech companies will have to inform the government of any plans to strengthen security, and then the government can say, not in this country, mate. So that is in itself a dangerous situation, in my opinion. Enables the Secretary of State to require tech companies to provide services or facilities for the purposes of facilitating or assisting an intelligence service to carry out its functions, and prevents tech companies from disclosing such services or facilities to anyone without permission of the Secretary of State. So they can instruct a tech company to open a gateway for the intelligence agencies to look at the communications of a particular individual or individuals or group, but they're not allowed to tell anyone, including the individuals or the group, that surveillance is going on. Now, the National Crime Agency has been campaigning on the issue of end-to-end encryption for years. So this is going back to 2018. This is a National Strategic Assessment of Serious and Organised Crime. And they said in that document, now the majority of internet traffic is encrypted and publicly available. That's their typo. Publicly available mobile device apps offer end-to-end encryption as standard. While this means enhanced privacy for the users, the use of encryption is impacting on law enforcement's ability to collect intelligence and evidence. So they were complaining about that 6 years ago. And then this week, or in the last few days, the NCA plus others released the joint declaration of European police chiefs. But of course, we're out of the EU now, aren't we? And they say in this, two key capabilities are crucial to supporting online safety. First, the ability of the technology companies to provide to law enforcement investigations in response to lawful authority with strong safeguards and oversight. I think that's also a typo, but anyway, the data of suspected criminals on their service. This is what is known as lawful access. Second, the ability of technology companies to proactively identify illegal and harmful activity on their platforms. This is especially true in regards to detecting users who have sexual interest in children, exchange images of abuse, and seek to commit contact sexual offences. So the child abuse narrative continues to be used to cynically, in my opinion, to push this forward. We are therefore deeply concerned, they said, that end-to-end encryption is being rolled out in a way that will undermine both of these capabilities. Companies will not be able to respond effectively to a lawful authority, nor will they be able to identify or report illegal activity on their platforms. As a result, we will simply not be able to keep the public safe. And of course, this was the narrative that we were receiving during COVID as well. We've got to do away with our freedoms, with our privacy, with all these kinds of things in the name of public safety. And this continues to be the sort of trope that they roll out in order to try to convince us to accept this bulk data collection and this mass surveillance. So I just wanted to sort of end this segment by looking at what you might do about it. And of course, the first thing to do about it is to use a VPN. Now, the VPN that I personally use, and I'm not sponsored in any way by Mulvad, but this is my choice, and explain why it's my choice in a second, use a VPN. Now, of course, this doesn't make you anonymous or hide what you're doing, because there'll always be somebody looking at what you're doing. Companies are bulk data collecting in terms of your browsing habits and so on. But what this does is it removes the ability for your internet service provider to collect metadata on what you're doing on the internet, because everything's being tunneled through your virtual private network. So that at least moves the problem away from our government and makes it much more difficult for them to follow what you're doing. It doesn't remove the possibility at all, but it makes it much more difficult. So if we pop that back up, I'll just explain why I think Mulvad is the VPN of choice. And it's this. If you want to pay with cash in an envelope without any name, address, or any other identifying marks, you can do so. So you just go to the Mulvad site, create an account number, and post the account number with your cash in an envelope to them. I'm not aware that any other VPN services allow this to be done. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, a very big tick in the box, aside from the fact that most of their VPN servers, if not all of them by now, don't store any logs because they don't have any hard disks or any other kind of bulk data storage capability. So I just let people know about them because they're relatively, compared to others that are sort of talked about on the internet regularly, they're relatively unknown, but they do offer a good service. And as I say, I'm not being paid to say that. That is the one I use. So we'll leave it there. Again, this legislation has gone through without a huge amount of pushback, it seems, from the general public. And I do wonder, perhaps, was that because there was a lack of awareness of what was being done? Let's move on to food production.
Yes, indeed, which is something we've looked at over the last few weeks and months, really since the start of the year. And we've concentrated very much on the way in which policy from the centre has pushed farmers towards making the uneasy choice not to grow food in order to take the risk out of their business. But what we haven't really looked at are the situations in which the decision has been taken out of their hands. So we look at natural England. And the reason we do so is that last week, Tony Juniper, the headman there, is talking about having a high five for everyone driving nature recovery, but we must not rest on our laurels. So we'll just cherry pick a few bits from his sort of 5-year point. And he talks about natural England, which of course is outside of government but funded by government, has supported the design and introduction of major legislative tools, the Environment Act, the Environmental Improvement Plan, but also, here we go, to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030, and indeed the Agricultural Transition Plan and, critically, biodiversity net gain, which we'll come on to. He talks about the funding and to achieve nature recovery, which has been a big theme of Steve Barclay's push on the sustainable farming incentive. And he's tripled the budget from 110 million, which is what it was back in 2019. He's always at pains to point out the closeness of his relationship with the now King Charles, shown here in the photograph with him. And he goes on to talk about food security, but in a slightly tone-deaf manner, in that, in effect, he's suggesting that there isn't really any sort of mutual disagreement between taking land out of production and food security. He is right, of course, to point out that long-term food security is impossible without a healthy, sustainable natural environment, but there's a way of doing that, and possibly not the way in which it is being done currently. For much more depth on this, I would encourage you to go to the No Smoke Without Fire series that Brian Gerrish and Debbie Evans are doing at the minute, particularly part 3, which deals with exactly this issue. But the reason I bring it up now is because there's a private member's bill going through Parliament at the moment, Sites of Special Scientific Interest Bill, which was just mentioned in Parliament back in March by Derek Thomas MP. And specifically, he talks about allowing the Environment Secretary to interrogate the science and scrutinise Natural England's decisions. It's Natural England that seems to have ridden roughshod over farmers' countryside management and their understanding of how to care for their natural environment. Now, the reason he says that is that to date, the Natural England have had the power to enforce a special scientific an area of special scientific interest. So he goes on to say, why does this matter? Because now, following confirmation of the SSSI, farmers are subject to the same Natural England staff dictating how they operate their farms. That includes their demand that farmers apply for consent to milk cows or keep livestock. There is the risk that farming businesses will become unsustainable, which will impact on the rural economy and food security, while no meaningful benefit to the environment is delivered. So he's absolutely right to call this out. And we look at the Nature Recovery Network, which of course is, they say, a joined up enterprise between DEFRA, Natural England and our partners, talking about their apex goal of improving nature. But the point, again, on this sort of accelerated process is taking us from protection to active restoration. And critically, the three areas, biodiversity loss, climate change, and public health and well-being, again, not really substantiated. They go on to pick out a few things that they're trying to target. An enormous amount of land, 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat they want to have achieved from this. And down at the bottom there, which is really important, improve access to nature, working across government to ensure that everyone lives within 15 minutes walk of a green or blue space. So a lot of walking, no mention of cars, of course. And a reminder, therefore, when we think about the 30 by 30 thing, that the 17 million hectares of land that are in agricultural use account for 70% of the total area of the UK. So just on the food security front, it is an absolutely enormous challenge to be able to produce enough food for an increasing population and give over 30% of that land to nature recovery. But on the biodiversity net gain side, we see the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board here, additional income streams. So again, talk about incentivizing farmers to actually do this. And in case you're sort of a bit shaky on the biodiversity implications, this came into effect into planning law in January, working to increase biodiversity. Essentially, it's an offsetting process. So they say it's mandatory for all new developments, regardless of whether this improvement is seen on or off site. But for off-site improvements, farmers can often lease their less productive land to developers or gain payment from these organisations for managing and improving the habitat in line with the management plan to improve biodiversity. So again, who decides what actually constitutes an improvement in biodiversity? And finally, they talk about this going on for at least 30 years. So this is really being driven by the Terra Carta and Sustainable Markets Incentive, which, as I say, is covered in great depth in the No Smoke Without Fire series at the moment, which I'd really encourage you to get into. But this is something we'll continue to monitor over the course of this year.
Yeah, and no doubt we'll talk about that in extra as
Absolutely.
well. Now, let's just end with online safety and media literacy. And we'll start off on online safety with this, which is a joint statement by Ofcom and the Information Commissioner, because they have got together, we reported on this at the time, to form the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So anyway, they have issued a joint statement on the regulation of online services. And so they're collaborating on themes that they describe as age assurance. Well, that's digital ID. Recommender systems, that's the algorithms that YouTube and others are using. Proactive tech and relevant AI tools. Default settings and geolocation settings for child users. Let's make sure the children are included so that gives us a justification for this. Online safety privacy duties. Upholding terms, policies, and community standards. And of course, that's how they're dealing with content on the online. They're going to enforce the requirement for community standards to be imposed across the board by the tech companies. So working together is going to move the online safety regime forward. And so that's what they're doing. But in the meantime, Ofcom has launched a consultation on their 3-year media literacy strategy. So they're very excited about this because, of course, media literacy is how we all identify whether something that we're looking at is mis or disinformation or genuine. So let's see what the quote is from Yi-Chung Tae from Ofcom. Publication of this strategy is timely. Indeed, it's more important now than ever to think strategically about media literacy, given the dramatic changes to the landscape over the last 2 decades. Since Ofcom started its work. Ofcom now defines media literacy as the ability to use, understand, and create media and communications across multiple formats and services. Does that seem like a good definition to you? It doesn't seem to really mean anything, but anyway, okay. The prize, he says, is clearly worthy of the collective effort. Imagine a UK where people possess the critical thinking skills to better spot mis and disinformation. Yes, indeed. Imagine that. Imagine when people are actually critically looking at the BBC and the Independent and the Times and the Telegraph and thinking, what a pile of nonsense they're pushing out on a daily basis. But don't worry, because Rishi Sunak was speaking at the Society of Editors annual meeting a couple of days ago, or yesterday, in fact, Well, he had this to say. Over the last 5 years, we, the government, have backed international media and free flow of information with over £600 million. It includes supporting the BBC World Service, which reaches over 300 million people each week and has planted countless seeds of freedom. And he is admitting here that BBC World Service is a soft power weapon of the British government in order to work towards regime change in other countries. That's what planting countless seeds of freedom means. And he also said it includes in training for journalists around the world. And that, of course, is part of the same exercise, because that's the use of Thomson Reuters Foundation and BBC Media Action to train journalists in the British mould and with British narratives and British ways of doing things. And just to end this little segment, the Financial Times and OpenAI, you will be glad to know, have struck a content licensing deal. This means that OpenAI now has full access to the full Financial Times archives, everything that they publish, because once you start looking at media literacy and how you want to view things on the internet, and with the increasing use of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and the likes in the future, we want to make sure that those ways of gathering information are only trained using proper sources. Isn't that right?
Seems so.
Yes. Okay. We'll leave you to think about that. And say thank you to Vanessa and to Charles for joining me today. And thank you to everybody who's watched. We will be back in a couple of minutes if you're a UK column member for some extra. But otherwise, see you on, what day is this? Yeah, see you on Friday. See you then. Bye-bye.
Right.